It feels like this video is becoming something of a tradition, but y'all know they released some cards that aren't the Season Pass card this week, right? Let's talk about them. First up is Moondragon, a 2/2 with an end of turn ability. If you have spent all your energy this turn on one card, she gets +2 power. Now, this is actually a pretty reasonable card. When I first saw it, I pegged it as worse Chamber, but for Doom 2099 decks, and that is half true. It definitely does fill that role, and it definitely doesn't really go outside of that role. But I will say I'm a little bit embarrassed that I missed this use case, because she also kind of goes in my favorite deck of the current metagame, in as much as it is viable in a world where people are doing a bunch of Star-Lord Goliath stuff. This card goes in ramp. It is not as good as Chamber, but it is very similar to Chamber. You play it, you play your 3 that ramps you, and then you play a 5, a 6, and a 7. And that's your entire game plan. And turns out that is actually using all of your energy, so you are getting a lot of points out of what this card is able to do. The deck didn't have a real backup plan to Chamber. A lot of the times what you'd see is a Jennifer Kale or a Valentina or just something else, but Chamber was a really massive power spike early. Your best draws were almost invariably having a Chamber into a Ramper, and now you get a lot more access to those best draws because this is budget Chamber, and because of the nature of what she is, she allows you to sometimes include an additional Ramper. So let's take a look at that deck, and then the Doom 2099 fairly predictable list before we get into talking about Magus. It looks a bit like this, and this is a pretty interesting deck because it puts you in a situation where you are allowed to have a third ramp card, and it's allowed to be a card that actually kind of works with your 2/2s. I'm not sold on the Spider-Man 2099, or I should say Superior Spider-Man. Sorry, there's a lot of Spider-Man in this game. I feel like Doc Ock. This is a card that is a good ramp card if you are able to turn it on, and if you are not able to turn it on, it is quite awkward. It's not nearly as good with Blink as cards like Luna Snow and Electro are. This is definitely your third best ramp card, but it does exist, which is interesting. And the way in which this card, Moondragon, operates pushes you away from Jennifer Kale. So I do think this is a thing that is worth experimenting with in these lists. I'm not saying it's a guarantee. You might be better off doing 2s and Jennifer Kale and not worrying about the Moondragon, but if you are playing Moondragon, I do think you care deeply about getting that third ramper in there. It just makes you worse at doing Blink stuff, which is a real cost that you will have to pay. This is definitely the backup plan and the backup plan. You would rather be playing Chamber Electro or Chamber Luna Snow, but if you have to, you can play this card Moondragon and Spider-Man, I'm never going to get his name right, the superior one, into whatever it is that you want to do later. It's not perfect. I'm not going to sit here and act like it is, but it does add quite a bit of redundancy to a deck that really benefits from having redundancy. And it adds a decent amount of power from a deck that really benefits from having power. If your 2-drop has 10 power, that's really good for what this deck is trying to do. Now, it does mean that sometimes when your backup plan is on, you're activating Chamber a little bit early. That's not ideal, but it does get you the actual cost that you need in order to allow Superior Spider-Man to do his job. I really don't want to start putting a tally in the corner of how many times I mess up Superior Spider-Man's name, like the Krillin-owned counter in Dragon Ball Z Abridged, but I might start having to. This is a deck that is similar to what you are already aware of, and Moondragon is adding redundancy and power to it. In other words, I think that this is actually the most embarrassing bit for me to miss, because this is one of my favorite decks in Marvel Snap. I love it so much, and I just totally whiffed on whether Moondragon actually goes in there. And after playing with it a bit, she does. This is a card, like, this is viable. I think this is good. And that is a really interesting spot for a card to fit into. I didn't expect that to be a thing she was capable of doing. I expected her to be a Doom 2099 bot, and I was like, well, you don't play Doom 2099 in the ramp deck, which is true. But it turns out you can play her there, and she is pretty good there. This Moondragon list comes from Ika, another, I guess I was going to say person, but Superior Spider-Man, not exactly a person. I don't know. I mess up this name too, is largely my point here. Anyway, This is a list from Ika that is just classic Doom 2099 stuff, trying to adapt to the current metagame in ways that I think are probably a little bit awkward. This is definitely a metagame that Storm is actively good in. Like, I'm not going to sit here and argue that. Like, you do get some really good stuff out of being a Storm deck when you're doing this kind of stuff. But a lot of the time when you run into a Star-Lord deck, you're just sitting there looking at them, and if you didn't have a Storm lane 1, then you're not going to do anything. Like, there is a lot of that kind of thing, especially with Star-Lord decks getting into the Zola space. You get really pummeled by that kind of stuff. This is the kind of deck that maybe needs a different situation to actually bear some fruit. Now, Ika did try a couple of different things at the top end. I believe there was an Aurora version of this build. What ended up happening was just that wasn't enough point output in a meaningful way, and so instead there's like a what if we roll good stuff on Hulkling kind of game plan. Hulkling's okay. I would not consider him required if you want to play this deck. Very much just there is a space for a big 6. Pick whatever big 6 you prefer. And in this case, the big 6 we prefer is let's just high roll something that gets us out of these matchups some of the time, like a 12 power leader or whatever. This is a reasonable enough deck if you're willing to commit to being a deck that has a cap. And the problem with that is that it's very bad to commit to being a deck that has a cap in a world where you're running around with people playing Fang Foom, Arnim Zola on your face. They're not playing capped and you are. And so you end up with a fairly awkward group of cards that in a different metagame would be a very reasonable thing to be doing, but in this metagame just kind of get outpowered by some of the ridiculous stuff other people are doing. This is also a deck where when you're looking for your curve, it is very impactful that you actually end up hitting it. You have an Invisible Woman in here. Make sure you get her when you can. Like, this is not the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I need to hold Invisible Woman for the final turn of the game, because you can end up being forced into making a suboptimal play if you do that. Like, sometimes you're going to want a cannonball in that final turn of the game, and you're going to be like, oh, well, I wasted my Invisible Woman. Don't waste her. Make sure you get value out of her. Now, this is still a deck that has some powerful cards in it. The Doom 2099 does go wide very, very profitably. Cannonball Mercury is very, very good. There are things that you can do. I don't want to make it sound like this deck is bad. It is just poorly positioned in a world where the point ceiling is so high, and it is sort of fundamentally unable to meet that point ceiling or meaningfully disrupt it outside of a storm. So what's the verdict on Moondragon? Well, I think she's a little bit better than I thought she would be. I was expecting her to be a Doom 2099 bot, and I wasn't expecting that deck to be any good, so I thought she'd be pretty bad, but she goes in ramp as well. I think that's like a very real place for her to go. I think she probably is an upgrade to that deck. I'm not sure how viable that deck is right now either, but if we're worried about that deck being not viable, that's a problem with other cards that have to get balance changed and not really about ramp per se. I think that the fact that she has more homes than I expected makes me more interested in this card than I was in my season ratings video. Of the two cards we're going to talk about, she's the one that I think I can see myself playing the most of going forward. Card number 2 is Magus. Now, this guy is actually kind of literally only doing one thing, and it is skip 5, copy Iron Man or Klaw. That's it. Like, that's the only thing I've seen people doing with this card. I thought maybe you'd be able to, like, do it was like, oh, I'm going to copy, like, a 1 or something in your Evo stuff. You're not doing that. It's not worth it. Like, sometimes if you jam this guy into your Star-Lord deck, you copy a Jim Hammond, and that's kind of nice with it, but that's not really what you're doing with it. The deck building cost of this guy is you put Iron Man and Klaw in your deck, and you play Warlock, and you use Warlock, and then you use this guy on the same turn, and you get an Iron Man or a Klaw, and you get a bunch of discounts into your hand, and that's it. That's the whole game plan. That's what you do. And that's not a bad thing to do. Like, as long as you're already skipping on 5, this kind of stuff does have some reasonable power output, especially when you hit the Iron Man. It is an extremely good thing to get an Iron Man when you're already skipping turn 5. It's like a free roll Iron Man, and in this metagame, anything that says double your power is going to be a relevant game piece on the board. Like, it is going to matter a lot. In fact, Iron Man himself, being a card that has 0 power, can sit in the front row, and doubles your power, makes him pretty good in a Fang Foom world. Like, that's a real thing that you got to think about. This guy, of course, when he copies it, will have 5, but effectively having more power than you actually have is a good way to sort of build boards against a Fang Foom, and that does kind of matter right now, because I would argue Fang Foom might be the defining card of this metagame if it isn't Star-Lord. And I think that this is a guy who is even more limited than Moondragon, which When they came out, I would have told you Moondragon was probably the more limited card, and I would have been wrong. This guy is more limited than Moondragon. He's literally only doing this. Moondragon at least goes in 2 decks, regardless of how good they are. I'm not sure this guy goes in any decks that aren't this, and frankly, I'm not sure this is the best way to play even the decks that he goes in, whereas I'm actually fairly optimistic on Moondragon ramp being kind of a thing. I think that this is a very uniquely positioned card, where he is asking you for such a commitment and such a small space of possibilities that he's almost sort of Phantom X-esque, where what he's asking you is so specific and his payoff is so odd that you only are able to do him in a deck that is dedicated to him. I also think that this really sort of drives home the point that it is entirely possible that they missed which Magus and Warlock they were making, because this is a card, Magus, that is evil Adam Warlock, right? That's who the Magus is. But he has no resemblance to Adam Warlock, the card, and instead resembles Warlock, the robot, whose father is a different character referred to as Magus. The rabbit hole goes deep. This is Big Baby's Magus Moon Girl list, and it does seem to be a pretty viable list in as much as Big Baby lists ever are, which is largely to say it's doing things the metagame is encouraging you to do right now. Explosive power on turn 6 and being able to double your power. It fits what people are asking you in terms of questions. When your opponents are doing Fang Foom things, if you are able to play multiple Iron Men, I think this is a very viable strategy at trying to beat Star-Lord decks. I'm not sure this is the perfect iteration of it, but I do think there is an ongoing list in this kind of space that is going to be a very relevant counterplay option to Star-Lord, where Star-Lord is stacking large, relatively static numbers. An ongoing deck can multiply its own numbers and go over the top of them. I think that is a powerful potential counterplay option, and this deck does lean into it, being able to do things like Magus after playing a Warlock. Magus gains the Iron Man text. That's a really powerful play pattern, and being able to skip allows you to do a ton of work in terms of where those points are actually going to go. If you can actually get multiple Iron Men onto the board, this is one of the strongest turn 6 power outputs that you'll ever actually see. Warlock is able to do a lot of work. The issue is you run into games where you don't have your game plan, and in those games Magus is also pretty okay, right? Like, the general thought process here is that Magus is another card that you are happy to play on 3 when you don't have Warlock, if you're going to be a Moon Girl gamer, which allows you to do something cool when you Moon Girl and skip, because Moon Girl and skipping is already built in. In addition, he can also stack on top of a Warlock, i.e. go Warlock into Magus, and if you're happy with your hand, you don't need to Moon Girl to duplicate it, or if you don't have the Moon Girl. So this is a card that serves as a redundancy piece. It is Moon Girl in that it is your turn 4 play when you do not have a Moon Girl. It is Warlock in that it is your turn 3 play when you do have a Moon Girl, but you do not have a Warlock. It is basically filling in for either of the cards the deck is actually built around. That's the best case for Magus that anyone has ever made. I really can't stress this enough. Like, this is one of the very few decks where it's like, all right, well, now I have a whole other group of viable game plans, where previously they were not nearly so viable. And I think that that actually is a great recognition from Big Baby. Big Baby is a player whose decks I love to dunk on, but I do think that it's worth giving him credit for recognizing this stuff, even though I'm 100% positive that if I asked him, he'd be like, I wasn't thinking about that at all, because all my friends love to do that. It's still a good thought process. You can see the same concept at play here, but I think largely the problem with a deck like normal Evo Star-Lord is you just get pummeled in the mirrors by the people who are doubling up on Evo Star-Lord. You have a better backup plan when you don't draw the Star-Lord, but I mean, like, you're more than 50% to draw the Star-Lord, so your opponent is also more than 50% to draw the Star-Lord, and if their Star-Lord is better than yours, it's probably not a matchup you want to opt into. In a sane world, I think this kind of stuff could be pretty good. I really don't want to act like that's not a real thing. I think it could be a very solid, very powerful direction for the decks like this to go. I think, again, like, you see the synergy between Magus and Warlock, which makes me wonder about that connection. there is something there. It's just this is the only thing he does. If you're not playing Warlock, if you're not playing Iron Man, if you're not playing Klaw, if you're not playing all of those cards, which no deck before this would ever even consider, then you're not really going to play Magus. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this. Is that yes, there are like some extremely niche scenarios like Big Baby's deck where he's like genuinely additive, but a lot of the time I think you're going out of your way to afford being able to play him, even though I will say in this metagame, being an Iron Man copier is probably one of the best possible things you can do. There is a lot of upside to that, but I do think that even then he's still a card that just comes up a little bit short. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful evening.